I believe we are live. Yes, we're live. Here is well, I'm live while I'm taping this. You're gonna not see it live, but it's live while I'm doing it right now. And we're going to continue in our study guide here as we push on through chapters 18 and 19. Probably by Monday, I'll have a better idea of when we want to test over this. As soon as we get through this, but where we need to be today is on page 2, where it says Nativism. So flip the page because we ended with the Zachary Taylor mystery yesterday, and was he poisoned or not? But Nativism today. So let's start with the study guide there. And in this case, there was a mass of immigrants coming from Europe, Irish immigrants with the potato famine of 1845-49. Other Europeans coming, and there were people that were here that believed immigrants were getting better treatment than they were. And nativism was a movement that there should be restrictions placed on immigrants, longer times to attain citizenship, longer times to attain voting rights, and that Americans who are here who are not immigrants but natives of America should be treated better than immigrants coming in. We've heard that somewhere, I think, but it's history doesn't change much. It just repeats itself. The election of 1852 is going to come around, and Millard Fillmore is always ranked as one of the worst 5 presidents of the United States. Remember that he became the 13th president when Zachary Taylor died suddenly in office after having his cherries and milk and sugar in July of 1850, and so the 2 candidates that are going to run are going to have Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire, and you're going to have, interesting enough, Winfield Scott, the commander of the U.S. war with Mexico that James K. Polk did not see as a political threat in 1848. If you remember, he moving all the troops from Zachary Taylor in northern Mexico to Winfield Scott's forces in New Orleans for the landings at Veracruz. But in 1852, Winfield Scott wants to run for president. And he's like, well, heck, if these other guys, these war heroes, can get elected president, why can't I? Now, Franklin Pierce is a senator from New Hampshire. His wife does not want him to run for president. She's like, I got a bad feeling about this. Don't do it. Don't do it. But he wants to be president. And he does something very simple. He looks at a map, and he looks at the Electoral College map and just does some numbers. He's like, if I could carry my home state of New Hampshire, and if I could carry every southern state, I win. But how does a senator from New Hampshire, northerner, carry every southern state? Well, this is what he does. By 1852, the Fugitive Slave Act, which had been passed as part of the Compromise of 1850, has become very controversial. People are upset about this up north. It's dividing this country, it's driving a wedge. And there's a movement up north to abolish the Fugitive Slave Act. Well, down south, they don't want the Fugitive Slave Act abolished. And so Franklin Pierce, in his desire to be president of the United States, runs on a simple platform that says, if you elect me, Franklin Pierce, as president of the United States, I will veto any legislation that comes across my desk attempting to abolish the Fugitive Slave Act. And this appealed to Southerners, and lo and behold, Franklin Pierce wins. And he is elected as the 14th president of the United States. Now, unfortunately for him, he has a tragedy befall him on his way to his inauguration. The train that he's riding in with his wife and his son, collides head on with another train. And the boxcar that they're in tumbles down the embankment. And as this boxcar is tumbling down the embankment, there's debris and glass flying through the boxcar itself, and a sheet of glass will decapitate their son in front of both of them. This is something that a parent would obviously never want to see, but much less ever be able to forget. Franklin Pierce, he's scratched up, and so is his wife, but as quick as he can, he gets his jacket off and covers up the body of his son so that his wife doesn't have to see this, but she never recovers from this. And she'll blame him for this, and she'll die 3 years later of a fever, but a lot of people think it was just a broken heart, and that a mother losing her son, especially in that capacity, and then her presidents here, you have these runs, unfortunately for him, because he's going to have a lot of volatility on his watch. The next thing that you see there is the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852. This was written by the daughter of Lyman Beecher, a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her husband was a professor at a place called Bowdoin College up in Maine, and she wrote this novel there, and it's a fictitious novel about a guy, a slave. I mean, what this book does is it portrays the brutality and injustices of slavery. And the reason this is a catalyst for civil war is because now the timing of the publication of this book, it becomes a bestseller in the United States and in England. And what it did for people is, now remember what's happening. We've had 2 years of the Fugitive Slave Act where people are seeing bounty hunters come grab people off the street and take them back down south. And you're also seeing white people who had helped these people who thought slavery was morally wrong, being thrown in jail for this. And now out comes a book that details what's happened to these people down south. And slavery becomes very, very real now for a lot of people up north. Remember, English had already abolished slavery in 1807, making it illegal. And so it's a very bestseller there. And they're looking to the United States, what's wrong with you guys? That this thing belongs in the Stone Ages. Slavery is morally and reprehensibly wrong. So you have that issue. And then you have now people are seeing it, live action, people being grabbed on the street. And now people are reading it and saying, oh, this is what's happened to them when they're taken back down there, down to the south. This cannot exist. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin takes a lot of people who were probably but prior to the Compromise of 1850 had been indifferent to the issue of slavery, but now have started to form an opinion on slavery to the point of now slavery is wrong. And the abolition movement is going to grow exponentially up north with the publication of this book. The next thing that you see on there is the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. The United States had visions, again, what they had achieved their manifest destiny in acquiring the territories from the war with Mexico, but now linking them. The only way to get there, as we've talked about with Gold Rush, was either sail around, walk overland, a wagon train overland across the United States, or take a boat to the Isthmus of Panama, cross over, and then come up to the west coast of the United States. And so there was an idea that what if we could build a transcontinental railroad? Well, it's very simple. If you've ever driven from El Paso to Tucson, there's not a whole lot out there, but what it is, it's flat. And this territory south of the Gila River was still Mexican territory. So what is now the bottom third of New Mexico and the bottom third of Arizona was still part of Mexico at this time. But if you've ever been out there, it's very, very flat, and it would be very easy to lay rail. And so the idea was, if we could purchase this flat territory, we could build a transcontinental railroad across the southern part of the United States from the East Coast to California. And so a deal was cut with the Mexican government to purchase James Gadsden, the foreign agent for the United States, to purchase this territory from Mexico for $10 million with the hopes of building a transcontinental railroad. That won't happen for another 16 years. As a matter of fact, the first transcontinental railroad will not be linked up across the southern part of the United States. They'll actually link up in 1869 at a place called Promontory Point, Utah, when two rail lines, one from California and one from Chicago, and they'll finally meet as they come across in Utah. So that's why the southern border of the United States looks like it does today, because of this purchase, and there's still nothing out there except desert. But we purchased it, and it belongs to the United States. But again, it was for the idea of building a transcontinental railroad across the southern United States. Our next topic there is Stephen Douglas of Illinois. He is a senator from Illinois. And Stephen Douglas has aspirations. He wants to be president of the United States. And to be president of the United States, you have to show that I can work across the aisle. I can do things, but you also have to do something magnificent. Now, he's not a warrior, so he can't claim a war record, but he wants to do something legislative-wise that would put him on the map, so to say. And his vision is building a railroad from Chicago in his home state of Illinois to the west coast of the United States. And by doing that, the city of Chicago would become a major port and influence. Now, keep in mind, in 1854, Chicago is only 17 years old. It was founded in 1837 and is doing okay as a port, but on Lake Michigan. But if we could link a railroad up, or we could connect the Pacific with the Great Lakes, Chicago would become a boom. But then it would also benefit people out west, And again, it would put him on the map. But railroads cost a lot of money to build. And so if I'm a Southern Democrat and I have a Northern senator come to me and say, hey, would you help co-sponsor this bill for me and this legislation so that I can get this railroad built so I can put my name on the map? And as a politician, I'm going to look at him and say, why should I do that for you? In other words, you want my help? What are you going to do for me? And so what comes out of this, this desire of Stephen Douglas to build a railroad, is what you see that next topic there, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And so what happened here was, to get Stephen Douglas is going to get the funding for his railroad with this act. But what Stephen Douglas gets passed as the author of this bill is Stephen Douglas will now put himself, even though he's a Northern senator, Stephen Douglas is going to put himself into the camp of the idea of popular sovereignty. And so what happens here is the Kansas-Nebraska Act does a couple of things. One, it repeals the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So for 34 years, slavery could not exist above the 36-degree, 30-minute line and what was left of the Louisiana Territory. And if you remember, that line is the Missouri-Arkansas border and the top of Texas on the Oklahoma Panhandle. That's the 36-degree, 30-minute line. Slavery could not exist above it. So now with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, that line is erased. It's gone. And popular sovereignty, the second part of it is popular sovereignty will decide the slave question and what's left of the territories in the Louisiana Purchase. In other words, the Kansas Territory is going to be able to decide whether they want slavery or not. And Southern pro-slave Democrats are for this because what it allows for the possibility of the expansion of slavery. And the more slave states there are, the more slave legislation they can get passed. But Stephen Douglas gets his funding for doing this. And it becomes very controversial because, as you look at the next thing there, so wait, let's make sure we understand what popular sovereignty is. Popular sovereignty is that the people who live in that territory will be the ones that decide, they'll just take a simple vote on whether they decide whether they want slavery or not. Now, early on, it's very clear that the people of the Kansas Territory are not pro-slave people. They're actually, and they're not necessarily abolitionists, but they're like, we don't want the institution of slavery. But if you look at a map, their next door neighbor to the east is Missouri. And Missouri is a slave-holding state. And Missouri would like to see Kansas come into the slave-holding state fold. Now, when this vote is supposed to be taken, all you have to do is be present on that day to vote. And so there's rumors that people from Missouri are going to cross over into Kansas and vote, even though they're not citizens of the Kansas Territory. And the people in Kansas who are starting to hear rumors of this push back and say, this isn't fair. You know, we don't want slaves. We don't want a slave state. And so you're going to have tensions start to increase. And you look at that term there at the bottom of your page where it says bleeding Kansas. It literally means what it means. You had what were called Missouri border ruffians. In other words, people or tough guys in Missouri that were pro-slave, that were crossing the border into Kansas and intimidating people in Kansas. They might knock on your door and they say, are you a pro-slave or are you a anti-slave? And they said anti-slave. They might say, well, that's too bad. I'd hate to see your barn burn down tonight. I'd hate to see your livestock run off. I'd hate to see your crops burn. Heck, I'd hate to see something bad happen to you. And so you're going to have physical and material intimidation by these border ruffians that are coming into Kansas. And people are going to be killed. People are going to be beat up. Property is going to be destroyed. And hence the term in 1855 and 56, you had this time in the Kansas Territory where they were known as bleeding Kansas. So if you flip the page, you should be come up to the top there to this May 21st, 1856, the burning of Lawrence, Kansas. Now, poor Lawrence, Kansas, it's had a rough go here. It'll have a rough go here over this 7-year stretch. Lawrence, Kansas is where the University of Kansas is today. And on May 21st, 1856, pro-slave Missouri border ruffians are going to ride into Lawrence, Kansas. They're going to beat up and pistol whip local merchants and other people that are anti-slavery. Nobody will be killed, but there's going to be a lot of people beat up. But the thing that they're going to do is they're going to burn the town to the ground. as an act of intimidation. And Lawrence, Kansas, which was an anti-slave town, is burned to the ground on May 21st, 1856. Poor Lawrence can't they'll rebuild, but during the Civil War, 7 years later, in 1863, a group of raiders known as Quantrill's Raiders are actually going to ride into Lawrence, Kansas, and burn it down again. So they'll have a rough 7 years getting their town burned down twice. But the first time is this, again, over the question of slavery. Now, the next thing that you see there is the hand of God, John Brown. John Brown claimed to be a devout Christian, and he and his 5 sons saw slavery as an evil upon America, and an evil that needed to be eradicated. And he himself proclaimed to be God's anointed, and that it was his job which says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay." Well, he's saying, I'm the debt collector. I'm gonna make you pay, and God's hand is upon me to do this. So after the town of Lawrence was burned on May 21st, 1856, 3 days later, John Brown and his 5 sons are going to ride into a Missouri border ruffian camp on the Kansas-Missouri border. Now, this particular camp that they're going to ride into had nothing to do with the burning of Lawrence, Kansas. None of the men in this camp took part in it, but these guys are there with their families. Also, on May 24th, 1856, John Brown and his 5 sons are going to ride into a place called Pottawatomie Creek, and they're going to go into this camp, pick 5 men, 5 fathers, and execute them in front of their families, and then ride off. And again, this is known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. And immediately, an arrest warrant is going to go out for John Brown for murder. Now, one of his sons will be captured, caught, and hanged, but John Brown himself will escape and get away. And he'll disappear off the radar screen for about 3 years, but he's going to resurface again in 1859. He has visions of someday being a martyr for this cause, that if I die in this cause, then I'm one of the great Christian martyrs because I died doing what God asked me to do and doing what I thought was right. But this is going to be kind of the apex and the peak of Bleeding Kansas, where people on both sides, property being destroyed, people being killed. It's going to culminate here with the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. In 1856, we're going to have an election, and the newly formed Republican Party is going to put a candidate up named John Fremont. John Fremont had been a pathfinder, found the California Trail. Fremont, California, up in the Bay Area, is named after him. But he's going to run against a guy named James Buchanan. And Franklin Pierce is not going to be even renominated by his own party. And let's back up to Franklin Pierce for a minute. Franklin Pierce, by the time he leaves office, will have lost his family, and he'll go up to New Hampshire and become a recluse and then drink himself to death in the end when it's all said and done. Again, he goes down as unfortunately for him, a bottom 5 president, but a lot of volatility on his watch. In the end, the election of 1856 is going to fall to a guy named James Buchanan. And James Buchanan becomes the 15th president of the United States. And unfortunately for him, he doesn't have a strong personality, and he's going to stuff is going to happen, and we'll get to that on the next lecture. Stuff is going to happen that he's going to sit back, that he should have prevented and should have stopped, but didn't. And it's going to embolden a lot of southern states to do certain things. But he goes down as a weak guy. Also, you have the succession here of weak executives, chief executives. But what's unique about him, he is the only president of the United States that had never married. He was a bachelor president, and there's some questions about him. Well, never mind. Anyway, so what that does, we're going to stop there. That takes us. We'll pick up. Okay, you guys take care, and we will see you soon.